Hello, and welcome back to Parley. This one was paid for by Lordrusty. If you're not them, I hope you'll enjoy listening. Lordrusty says, okay, March's Parley is a bit more of a ramble, perhaps not my most thought out, but here we go. Me and my partner were discussing the idea of being a main character. After I was explaining what had happened in my dream, and she was shocked by the idea that I could consider myself not the main character in my own dream. While there are philosophical ideas at play here, such as whether you believe you're a bit part in life or that you're the center of your own world because you're the one perceiving it, I'm here to propose that the way that the phrase main character moment is used in pop culture is wrong. People tend to use it to mean a moment when someone is displaying individuality or flair, but in games at least, that really seems not to hold water. I'm constantly haunted by BioWare's graphic on player choice, and the fact that 40% of the player base chose male soldier with the default face. 40% of people chose man with gun as their choice for a grand space opera because they just went with what the game told them to pick as a default. Or the fact that D&D's most played class race combo is human fighter. In fiction, the main character also tends to be the blandest of the primary characters, as there's a desire to make them a relatively blank slate so people can map themselves onto that character. I've come to the conclusion that trying to distinguish yourself as being the main character is a bad aim. We should all instead accept that we are NPCs, and strive to be the most interesting NPC we can be. You have the option to be the nameless innkeeper or to be Shogarath, the Prince of Madness. Shogarath? You can be one of just another storekeeper on the Citadel or Morden Solus, all singing, all dancing, all scientist. Almost all of our favorite characters from the games are NPCs. Well, there's some stuff to disagree with there. I'm going to go through the parlay a little bit and talk about respond to some things you specifically wrote. And then I've got kind of 3 topics planned to discuss. First of all, basically what is a main character, the way you're using it, but also some types of main character. A second bit about blank slates, specifically a type of main character archetype design that I think warrants some further discussion. I believe it is quite misunderstood. I think people often make a lot of assumptions. You made a lot of reasonable, but I disagree with them, assumptions about main characters. And finally, to come back to this point, at the end of the parlay, you kind of concluded by suggesting that this would be a good goal. I'm going to frame that goal a certain way. I think that in a certain sense, yeah, that's a good insight. But I want to come back and talk about that. First, just to make a few observations throughout the parlay. The main one really is just that in many places, it's important to keep in mind that this may be very perspective limited. For example, you said in fiction, the main character also tends to be the blandest of the primary characters, as there's a desire to make them a relatively blank slate so people can map themselves onto that character. A lot to unpack. First of all, my lived experience, this is literally just wrong, but of course that's not correct. That's just because I've read a limited subset of work, just as you have. So I would say we definitely don't know if that is broadly true. I don't think that's a particularly aggressive claim, don't get me wrong. The idea that a lot of main characters in fiction tend to be blank slate type main characters, rather than, I'm going to suggest a few other types in a few minutes. That's not like a really strong claim or anything, but I'm not sure I'm convinced that it's as much of a majority as you're suggesting it is. It's also a big assumption that the reason that is or isn't the case, but the blank slate thing, the reason for that being used is both because there's a desire to make them a relatively blank slate and so that players can map themselves onto that character. I might be more willing to agree that that is why the character is written as a blank slate, but I'm personally going to, in section 2, strongly disagree that a lot of people actually want to map themselves or actually do map themselves onto that character. Role-playing, I will suggest, is hard. And a lot of people are not actually doing it. There's a lot of other benefits to the blank slate type, and I think that media broadly overestimates that people want to self-insert when in fact, according to me, they don't. Some people do, but not as many as people think, and neither they nor I nor you know exactly how many people that is. I'm going to present some arguments that it's less than people think. So that's a thing. This is mostly just grounding for the story, but I'm convinced that we really should do the first part first. Get some groundwork, do some terms about what a main character even is in this context. In your first paragraph, you define a main character as, I would say, kind of a point of view character. And I'm going to go off that for a sec. Let's abstract for the purposes of this parlay. And I'm taking some liberties here because Lordrusty said it was just more of a ramble and perhaps not that thought out. So forgive me for kind of adding some structure. I hope that's okay and doesn't take it too far off course. For the purpose of this parlay, let's say that being a main character means being the point of view character. So when you had a dream and you like weren't the main character in your dream, I'm assuming that part of what you meant is the dream wasn't from your perspective or focused on you in some way. It might not be perspective, but focused on, that character. This is different than maybe you could think of the term protagonist as more meaning someone who is involved in driving the plot forward, which may or may not be the point of view character. So normally I'm not sure that's that helpful. I think I often use protagonist and main character interchangeably. But for the purpose of this discussion, let's draw a line and say we're talking about the point of view character, the focus character to some extent. The player character if it's a game. And I want to suggest 3 kinds of that character that they can be characterized. Even them not being characterized is still a category. And of course, it's the blank slate. I would say they're one big category, the most obvious one so far, is the blank slate character. They're defined by having the least qualities. They made the least choices. Of course, they probably have qualities, but those qualities where they exist will tend to be very general qualities. This is your default character. So if you pick the default settings in a game for a character, you're a human fighter. That's not exactly the default. We'll talk more about that later. But the male soldier with the default face thing from BioWare games that you mentioned, that would be like a blank slate quality. Now, through these 3 types I'm going to define for the sake of discussion, it's not as if a character will be just one. I suppose you could, and stories do that. But usually they'd be a blend of them. Anyway, blank slateness. I feel like it's pretty self-explanatory. But it's in contrast to a second type I'm going to define. I'm going to call these paragon characters. Paragon main characters, or point of view characters, these are characters that are defined by being kind of a word cloud of things that are meant to be unobjectionable or agreeable to the player, the audience. It's meant to be that we don't have to spend time, getting into it with this character's moral decisions. They're on the side of right, and we're meant to understand that they just are on the side of right. Good, if you want to say it that way. The problem, of course, being that we don't all agree on what is good. If you take a word cloud of things that are the qualities that the paragon should have, none of us have the same word cloud. They might be similar-ish. There are some qualities it might be pretty easy to put in the word cloud, pretty safe. Freedom-loving, individualistic. It's not common to find people that would disagree with putting that in the word cloud, but they exist. I'm not sure we need to worry about that much, but I do think most of the others we do. For example, it's quite common to see players heavily value family or their country in a way that I'm sure some of us don't relate to or feel is entirely healthy or sound. There's a very common trope that love is basically a get out of jail free card from the morality of any action, which I don't agree with. You can't do literally anything for love and still keep me on your side as the audience. Now, you can probably keep most people on your side, and also you don't have to keep me on your side for the story to be good. But at that point, you are less the paragon type of character and more probably this third type of character, which I'm going to call a viewpoint character. These characters are not blank or like an archetype of good. They're just odd, rather than being the most beautiful vista to look at the story from upon, the paragon, or the average vista, the average of everyone's perspective on the story, the blank slate, you could say. This character is the least average. Instead, you could think of it that way. Or they're, while avoiding being the paragon, you take the blank slate and the paragon and make a character that is as opposite to both of them simultaneously as you can be, and that's the viewpoint character in a nutshell. I think that's the ideal viewpoint character anyway. These characters are here because they have an odd relationship to the story. It's interesting to see the story from their perspective. The story may, I think it's often employed for this reason, the story may not be that interesting from many other perspectives, but from their perspective it is interesting. Or it could be a very common story, but it's uncommon to hear the story from this perspective. It's also simply common for it to be another level of alienation to make something seem weird. The story is already very strange, and our perspective is not conventional, although that's not often done. Generally, this would be used narratively, of course, to create some contrast, some flavor savors on the palate, gross, to provide some contrast while not totally alienating the audience. A combination of a familiar story with an unfamiliar perspective, or an unfamiliar story with a familiar perspective, is generally a stronger combination. And I think that what I would agree, going back to your note about fiction having the main character tending to be the blandest of the primary characters, what I would agree is that it's overwhelmingly common for it to be one of the things I just said. Either that the main character is pretty bland, or a paragon character, which I also think is kind of bland, but the story itself is quite unusual. Or the main character is very unusual, but the story isn't. Like, it wouldn't otherwise be an unusual story, but the main character is an odd perspective. An example of this type of character that I've really enjoyed is the protagonist of The Black Company, the main character, the focus character, whatever. The Black Company, Glenn Cook, The Black Company, yep, is a series about the Black Company, which is a mercenary company, but the point of view character is the doctor and analyst, kind of the surgeon, field doctor, medic. He has, I would argue, among the least plot agency. I think that's common with viewpoint type main characters of all the characters in the story. But he's an interesting person to see the story happen from, partially because what happens to the characters in the Black Company is almost always grueling and brutal and long and hard. And seeing the results of that, so we still experience it, without having to go through it every time, is definitely one of the many perks to that character. Another perk is that it gives you more of a feeling of, it bucks that trend of feeling like, couldn't they just fight harder or have more power? The main character doesn't really deal in having power, which is basically plot agency, at all. So that isn't something that is that focused on. It always feels like doing things by being powerful enough to resist the forces against you is sort of out of reach. That's how I felt anyway. And I think that was good. It helped focus the story on the ground a little bit more. I really felt like I was with those characters on the ground in the tents, rather than being, there are like super powerful characters there, which would normally, I think, be the focus characters in a story. But in this story, we didn't follow them. And again, my experience is that is common, not at all rare. I don't know whether it's more common than not. It probably isn't, sure. But I would like to suggest that the main character tending to be the blandest of the primary characters is a personal bias to some extent. And me thinking that is also a personal bias. I don't like those stories, so I tend not to watch them or consume them. Therefore, I think that relatively more media isn't like that. I just wanted to point out that neither of us really know. You're probably right that it is more common for stories to not feature a viewpoint character. The paragon is something I associate with being from older stories, and the blank slate is something maybe increasingly common just because I'm noticing it more, but certainly has a lot of historical precedent. Maybe the blank slate is actually more common. But viewpoint characters, also have a history. I just wanted to point out, not only are these all not set categories, I'm not sure that if it appears that one of them is currently really popular, I just want to remind you that all three have extensive historical precedent. If you think about it, there are lots of stories from all of these places, simply by explaining that, one, a lot of older stories were used to present Paragon ideals, so of course that would be common. Two, the blank slate character was heavily used in things like, I would say the Commedia dell'arte employs the concept of a blank slate character. Basically, having stock characters is, I think, kind of the cousin of the blank slate character. The slightly weird but still similar cousin. Although I wonder if maybe blank slates have gotten more common. And viewpoint characters are the people who wrote most stories earlier in time. Nowadays, it's easier to have a relatively broader perspective, even if people don't like go seek that out and use it effectively. Whereas if you were, in a situation where you could just write a story, a lot of those people just were themselves personally in weird perspectives. And so a lot of stories being viewpoint character stories isn't unexpected either. Although, admittedly, I'm having a little bit more trouble thinking of like old viewpoint stories. Certainly modern ones I can think of quite a lot. I want to say that another really interesting variant of a viewpoint character is having them be, they're very close to the person that is the paragon or blank slate of a story, but they're not them. That it's not always that they're like really different, like way far away from them. I just think that's fascinating, but it's a topic for another time. So when you say that people tend to use a main character moment, not a term I'd heard before, by the way, but anyway, to mean someone who's displaying individuality or flair, I would argue they're using it to refer to a paragon main character, sometimes a viewpoint main character, not a blank slate. And you go on to argue that that's inaccurate partially because the protagonists of games or stories are overwhelmingly blank slates, which I don't think is true. But indeed, I do think that doesn't refer to all like good point of views. Let's say it that way. The idea that being a main character is good, and that to be a main character you do the paragon thing. If anything, I would argue that's the worst kind of main character. So I would agree in that sense, but definitely I don't agree that it's like not common for main characters to be like that. Which brings us to part two, which is that in video games, at least, I think it's important to keep in mind just how many reasons there could be that a player is picking what seems like the default combo, other than that they want a blank slate character. And also that blank slate characters have functions other than projecting yourself onto them. I don't have a lot of good things to say about projecting yourselves onto a blank slate character, so I'm not going to talk about that too much. It's a familiar idea to a lot of people, so I don't think that's a big deal. Role-playing ain't bad, but actually one of my points is that I think really role-playing, which is one reason you might want a blank slate character, we'll talk about it more in a sec, is hard. Not as often truly accomplished as people suggest. Role-playing games, sometimes that's used as a genre word to mean things that aren't focused on role-playing, but even the role-playing games that are about role-playing, you're meant to play a role, kind of like acting or improv. Dungeons and Dragons is a game that at least features that feature. Not everyone plays it that way, and that's fine. But you certainly can. It certainly invites you to play it that way. It's designed relatively primarily to be played that way among other ways. Sure. But I would argue that a lot of people don't that much roleplay. They might have sort of a bit or an angle on themselves, but truly playing a role that is different than yourself, it's hard. That's hard. It's difficult to not be yourself. True good acting is challenging, of course. I don't think that's a strong claim. But my point is simply that if that was meant to be the function for a lot of these things, it would be quite an amazing claim that a lot of people would be using a blank slate character to project onto successfully. Like that would suggest that almost everybody playing that type of story is failing to do the thing that type of story does well. It would be remarkable if such a thing was true and yet it was still very common to have that type of character. So I think there's a good argument to be made that there are at least a lot of other reasons why that's the case, besides that people actually are projecting onto those characters. Because if that was what was happening, I would argue a lot of people are not succeeding, which is fine, by the way. It's hard. I don't a lot of the time. So it would be weird if that was really popular and yet it's like not really working, according to me anyway. What are some of those other reasons? Well, one of them could just be instruction. As you said, 40% of people chose Man with Gun as their choice for a grand space opera because they just went with what the game told them to pick. Well, I'm sure there's a great variety of reasons why they went with that, but one of them is definitely that that was the default. This could be because they simply don't care about that part of the game. It doesn't have anything to do with their desire to have a blank slate. It may simply be because they don't care at all about the role-playing aspect of the game in the first place. It simply doesn't matter to them at all in any way what their character looks like, or they can't think of why it would be valuable to them. Of course, again, I'm not trying to say it's one or the other. I'm sure for a lot of them it is because they've thought that was generic or didn't make a statement about them. I definitely think a big kind of related feeling to that is that players might feel a little self conscious or embarrassed in some way, even if no one is watching, to pick a very particular character because that is to say a lot about themselves and wear themselves on their sleeve, not a thing that feels particularly safe in a lot of parts of our society. I treat that like it's natural and easy and what you should normally do, but I am well aware that I am fortunate to be in a community of people who are pretty accepting, and that's why I'm willing to just say goodness knows what while we record, the Pantaloon Saloon channel stuff or when I stream or whatever, right? I am a person who does kind of wear my thing on my sleeve, but I don't have the most weird things I want, to be fair. I don't have particularly hard desires to wear on my sleeve. And I also have an unusually good environment to do that in. So I think that's related. Um, Again, I think it's worth going a little more on the topic of they might not know why they would enjoy that aspect of gameplay. It might not be that they don't like it or no, they do like it. They might just not know how they feel about it. And some people would react to that by picking something weird. Others might react to that by not picking anything because they just can't be bothered to figure out whether they'd enjoy that. That's fine. They might already have in mind what they're going to enjoy about the game and they view that as a distraction or an annoyance. Just get it out of the way, get me to the gameplay I wanted, right? Perfectly fine, totally normal. But it doesn't really say anything about what they think about that character choice. They did as close to you can as not making a choice. They did, of course, have to choose something, but they didn't choose it using thinking that's related to the choice. That's my point. It was related to avoiding choices. In Dungeons and Dragons, though, there isn't really a default as per se. Now, on websites like D&D Beyond that let you make a character, it occurs to me that there might be a default and it might be human fighter in that interface. So I don't know about that. If that is true, then that explains it pretty cleanly. But let's consider that a significant amount of the data probably isn't that. It's probably true that a lot of people pick human fighter, even though they do have to pick just as much as any other option when they pick that. In fact, in my own DMing, I have actually had this experience. People, and it's very predictable people, like I always guessed correctly when someone would do this, pick human fighter. That's a real phenomenon. You definitely don't need to be online for that to be a thing that occurs. I'm a very small sample size. Just to say this anecdotally, you can find a lot of people who will say, yeah, there has been a lot of maybe memory bias, but people pick human fighters a lot, okay? Why? Why? I think part of it is also actually kind of that they do want details on the character, but they don't want to start with a model that has details they didn't choose. This is hard to describe. If I pick to be a Zandy, who has experienced identifying as male my whole life, pick to be a female Tabaxi, I am going to, without adding any actual details to my character, just to convincingly roleplay that character, I'm going to need to probably talk a little differently to have my voice read as not being like male human Zandy, right? Stuff like that. People can identify lots of voices as being a certain way. Your voice is valid even if it doesn't sound male or female to people. I'm just saying that that will cause me to make some decisions about how I portray my character before I have made like background decisions and such about my character, which might be a lot. Some types of players might feel like I would prefer to start with something simple and build up off of that. Characters aren't interesting because they're not human fighters. This is what people who see these statistics always say to rebuttal it. Although I don't think a lot of those people did play really interesting characters, but that doesn't mean they didn't want to. That's a big thing for me. A lot of them probably use that as a way to try playing a character, to get out of their comfort zone a little bit by using something relatively familiar, like how it's usually most effective to have a familiar story with a viewpoint, point of view character, main character, or an unfamiliar story but with a familiar paragon or blank slate character. It's the same thing. We don't think that's weird. It just makes sense. This is the same thing. How weird it is based on your perspective. So I think it's totally expected that people would pick the thing more or less closest to what they are, a human fighter. Anyway, maybe a human rogue. Anyhow, well, let's look. Actually, you did link the table. That's almost the second most popular. So, elf, wizard, and ranger. But elf ranger is a super paragon or blank slate as well. The data says that it is from just D&D Beyond, but I'm quite confident claiming that this would be represented elsewhere. It's certainly been a lot of people that you will talk to's experience in real life as well. And it makes sense why. I do want to quickly note, since I have this data up, that while human fighter was the most common, it's not by that extreme an amount. It's by enough that you wonder what's going on, but it's not by a huge amount, which also supports the argument I'm trying to describe. This idea that people playing a blank slate isn't as common as maybe it seems like it is, or people think that it's more desired than it is. They are common compared to the other options, but for people who haven't seen this data, just to summarize, there's maybe 10 or 12 other combinations that are over half as popular as human fighter. So human fighter is only just barely twice as popular as like most of the other combinations. It isn't even twice as popular as some of the others, like elf ranger looks like the second most popular from a quick glance at this. I've seen this before, but I'm just refreshing my memory. Which again, I think that makes sense. It supports the idea that that isn't a motive that is actually particularly broad. It's just significant. And again, if you want that goal, well, we humans have in common that we are human, and so you would expect that they would pick human fighters. Anyway, I think that's interesting. I think it's food for thought that there are a lot of reasons people might pick a simple option that may not have anything to do with like what that means to them. To be blunt, I think it's very common for people to assume that people are picking an option for the same reason they would pick that option themselves. In other words, if I pick Tabaxi Rogue because I want to use my epic, super interesting 420 no scope, feline agility plus, cunning action dash to move 120 feet in one round and then hit them with the assassinate on turn one before the enemy can get around in combat. And I'm like, oh, that's so badass, and I'm the coolest person ever because I made a build in a video game. And then Joe Average over here picks a human fighter. I might think, well, if I was boring, I would pick a human fighter, so they're boring. Which, like, no. Joe Average is a character actor who's most comfortable using their impressive, far superior to my acting chops in a character that they're just not as interested in exploring race or species, class, as prompts for role-playing. Their backstory may be very elaborate. It might be very normal, and they just play. They want the challenge of playing off of that. They might not be interested in that at all. They might be trying to learn, or they know the mechanics as well as I do, but they want to focus on the basics and see how much fun they can have with that. They might be a game designer, and they want to investigate how well it works, or what that experience is like. They saw this data, and they want to mimic it. It's the least likely that they picked to be that for the same reason you would have picked to be that. I'm not really talking to anyone specifically here. I'm just trying to make the point in general that I think people make assumptions about why people pick certain characters that are, if it comes from their own experience only, that is almost guaranteed to be incorrect. That's very unlikely that you both have the same motivation. After all, you didn't pick the same thing. Anyway, finally, to conclude the parlay with a little discussion about distinguishing yourself as the main character. You said, I've come to distinguish the conclusion for the parlay that trying to distinguish yourself as being the main character is a bad aim. We should all instead accept that we're NPCs and strive to be the most interesting NPC we can be. I think there's kind of two things here. The first one is, yeah, using the framing I gave before, I would agree that the Paragon and Blank Slate characters are kind of boring to be and also kind of impossible to be. So having that as a goal isn't good. Be a weird NPC, which is the viewpoint character. I agree. I would also like to point out that if we were all immortal and had unlimited time to tell stories, the viewpoint character is much less expendable than other types of characters because they're the only one of those three types of characters, at least the ones I defined, that is meant to be different story to story. The Paragon character is defined by being expected, and the Blank Slate character is defined by being nothing and therefore expected. So viewpoint characters would quickly become the only interesting thing left if you consumed thousands of years of stories, so I would predict. This is true in life as well. I think that you will value less and less Paragon and Blank Slate type people, and it will only be worthwhile to you to pursue getting to know viewpoint people. So I would agree that even just through brute force, it is likely the best goal to try to be a viewpoint character. However, I think the way you've worded this, it does have a subtext that you may have intended or not, that is kind of about humility as well, about not thinking yourself as being the focus of a story, which I actually mostly disagree with. I think that a lot of people do that in a way that is self-centered, but it's good to want your life to suit you. And that is a form of being the viewpoint character, being the main character, but a viewpoint character that I think is very good, like can be very valuable. I don't necessarily think it's bad to think of yourself as the main character for morale purposes either. Thinking of yourself as venturing forward to do the thing and make your life, your grand task, go well. I think that's very good, provided you have the perspective that the reason you should care about that is because you don't matter and no one cares. Like, you're the only one who's going to be on your side about that. I think the problem is that a lot of people, and these are just people who are spoiled and immature anyway, have this perspective that they should care about their life and think of themselves as the main character because they like really do matter a lot, you know, or they're supposed to have it be that way. But it's the opposite. And yeah, I have had mostly the experience that people tend to fall into excess humility before then coming back up to like a healthy level of I'm just dust in the wind, but like I care, so I'm going to make it good for myself. If you're trying to do things in a way that makes them as good for you as possible and you don't harm anyone else, you basically hit the balance. It's not rocket science. But I think the problem is that the underlying motivations are tricky. A lot of people can't let go of this idea that there kind of must be external validation. They have to be important for a reason other than just them. And there's nothing I'm going to be able to say in this parlay that will make people let go of that. They're going to just have to, I wish there was. They're going to just have to give up on that eventually. There isn't. You are not important. You do not matter. None of us do. That's kind of the great part in some sense. That being said, I think that once you have that perspective, which I guess I just said at you, but again, I don't think it's going to convince anyone. It can be valuable to think of yourself as being a little bit more central. That can be a useful concept. Thinking about things from the perspective of, hey, I woke up today, here I am in this weird place. What am I gonna do with myself? You know, isn't bad. I think that can be very helpful, speaking from my own experience. But it's really valuable to view yourself at times as being the NPC in like social situations, imagining yourself as being a viewpoint character where you are the focus character, but you're very rarely the person who's actually important in a given moment is quite vascular. Like that's good. You should acknowledge that. That's true. And indeed, I think people gaining the maturity to be resigned that a moment isn't about them is valuable. Something I've found difficult as a weird closing thought in my own work is that my job is to have mostly my thoughts be mostly the center of attention. It can be difficult to remain mature and interested in others while like I'm supposed to have my thoughts be like the center thing, you know? Um, Having the balance to occasionally give it up to the audience, or I try to do it much more than occasionally, and make sure that Parley is enough about your original idea and not just my reactions to it. I do think that makes Parley better. Having it be that when I'm done working, I kind of switch modes a little bit and it's not so much about me. It does help that like I don't really want to hear more about my ideas after like a whole work day of hearing about my ideas. I have to listen to this too, you know? I don't really need to hear that anymore. So yeah, it's not the hardest thing I've ever done, but it's not easy. And indeed, I think that in our culture in general, you are often encouraged to be self-centered in a unhealthy, mentally unhealthy way, or you are considered to like not have enough initiative or something. When in fact, people who genuinely always like have enough initiative are insufferable most of the time, and nobody really wants that. So it's hard. Like that's difficult. None of the criticism in this parlay is intended to be, because it's so easy to be better. It's not like it's fine. In fact, that was basically my point, is that it's actually quite difficult to get something out of a lot of these types of protagonists. Finally, I thought I'd end on contemplating your sentiment that almost all of our favorite characters from games are NPCs. Is that true? Yeah, I guess. I'm troubled that almost all characters from games are NPCs. So it feels a bit unfair, you know? It kind of feels like I would need to go through every game I'd played and rank how good I feel about the main character, and then how good I feel about my favorite NPC, or take my I'm gonna hate the favorite part, so take my top three and average them or something. Or the highest score an NPC can achieve in the game, whatever, and then see if, as games go by, it's true that I preferred some of the NPCs over the main character most of the time. I think I do, but I don't know. Like I don't care in the slightest about projecting myself into a game, so I generally want the character to be like one of my least favorite things in games is when there basically isn't a main character, um, or it's sort of from the I perspective. Generally that's just a strict minus to me. If the main character had a personality and I just have to kind of drive them or be like a fly on the wall on their shoulder, click dialogue options that I don't think at all, that are opinionated, that are not blank slate dialogue options, that are a character. Like I prefer that generally. I don't care about me being in the story. That means I'm not going to be able to resonate with it anyway. So yeah, I wonder, because there are some main characters in games that I really like. Anyway, a thought for another time. Thanks very much for the very interesting prompt. Lordrusty, I thought it was pretty coherent, by the way. You said more of a ramble. I didn't think it was like that. If you want to get your own one of these, you can check out the details on how to do that just below the video in the description. For now, I want to thank Lordrusty very much for their support. I hope you enjoyed listening.